All right, so you've all come here to learn about subproject struggles, the community versus the company.
So we do want this to be interactive. So if you want to come closer, that would be good too.
Yeah, please.
Come here. We are all friends here.
Come closer, please.
Yes, please come closer.
Yeah, we want this to be a conversation. You know, we've got like 3 slides that we're going to show.
Yeah, that's about it. But we want to hear your struggles and where you see issues and problems and things like that too.
Right, yeah. So quickly, I'm Michael McCune, El Mico. I work for Red Hat. I do cloud provider and auto-scaling stuff. This is Dims. If you don't know him, I think there should be a guidebook around here or something.
I didn't put that. I'm sorry.
So yeah, I put that. Do you want to give yourself an introduction?
So my nickname is Dims. So and my wife calls me Dims too. So.
What if she's mad at you?
It's like Dims exclamation mark, right? Okay, so why are we having this discussion? I think a big part of it is that several months ago, sometime last year, I think, Dims and I started to get into a discussion about cloud controller managers and around features and where they exist. And through this discussion, we started to talk about who owns projects and what does it mean to maintain a project and what does it mean to put a feature into one project over another and how do these things get expressed in the community? Did you want to add anything?
No, that's a really good summary. So, there are so many so many repositories within Kubernetes, right? And there's maintained by different set of folks, and some of these repositories are maintained by the regular community members that are spread over multiple Kubernetes repositories. Some of these repositories are from like service teams that are mainly in specific repositories that relate to, some vendor-specific code or something like that. Everybody has different motivations on what to work on, how to work on, and how to prioritize things, and what deprecation means and things like that. So it was a really good discussion over a specific problem, but then we realized that this is a general problem and a pattern that keeps happening across. So we said, let's have a chat here with you all, so we can learn each other's issues and viewpoints as well.
So, let's do a little story time here to motivate this. And I think some of these stories, I've tried to leave the names out so that, I'm not trying to be accusatory about what's going on here. And I'm going to start with the top one, which is the one that Dims and I really got into. And that does relate to, that's the only thing I'll talk about specifically, I guess. Load balancers are a cool thing, and we like them because when you make a service that hooks to a load balancer, you can get the features that someone like AWS might provide through their application load balancers or their classic load balancers or network load balancers, right? And if you look at the Kubernetes documentation and you read about cloud controller managers, they talk about this relationship between service objects and load balancers that might be there for a specific cloud. And so an issue came up that some Red Hat developers were looking at where there's a very specific feature that we were interested in that is part of AWS's service. Now, I think I wasn't aware of this, although other engineers that I was talking to were, is that this functionality exists in what's called a load balancer controller, which is separate than the cloud controller manager. And so we started this discussion because, as many of you might be able to empathize with, we have customers who are interested in using this feature, which is a great feature. And so we wanted to figure out, is there a way for us to bring this into the common code? Mm-hmm. And that's where we started this discussion because, as you can imagine, the maintainers right now are mostly AWS maintainers, or they work for AWS. But the project is owned by the SIG, right? And this is exactly the core of the issue. So how do we be good community members, maybe be able to contribute something with the expectation that we would help to maintain it? Or if we're not going to do that, then we need to figure out how do we migrate to this other thing? And more to the point, how do we help Kubernetes users to understand that relationship? And so that was kind of one of the first ones. I don't know, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's a fair thing. Also related is like there was one more repository which had the actual load balancer controller, and that had an old one and the new one. So that it was not just the cloud controller manager for AWS, but it was also this other repository which had which existed even before this extracted cloud provider stuff. So it had a convoluted history. Let's put it that way, right? And not all decisions that were made were clearly marked in the documentation or in the README. So that was the other problem that we were facing.
Yeah, and kind of adding into the story then is that, okay, so this situation exists. People who know how to manipulate these operators and controllers know what to do. But if you were using one and wanted to use the other, we as a community had not yet developed a documented migration pattern. We hadn't tested how someone would take a service that had existed under one feature set and under one controller and is now existing under a different feature set and controller. And so this just kind of exacerbated what we're talking about here. Yeah. And I think, we put a few other examples up here that we talked about. So like another project, and I think this is, you might imagine that rebasing things is a task that we do frequently, and I think if our project managers and leadership have anything to do with it, LLMs will be doing this like in the next generation. Go to Walter's talk on Friday, by the way, like if you're interested in that topic. It should be fascinating, but get there early because it will fill up, I guarantee it. And so rebasing is something that is very easy to bring new community members in because it's a task that someone who is new to Kubernetes could try out, they could rebase the project, they could make a meaningful pull request. This can be complicated in situations where your project has tooling that is not, let's say, standardized or is not common in a way that everyone understands how to operate it. And so for new users who are coming to that project, they say, hey, look, I did this great thing. I want to try to get involved. And it's difficult for them because the tooling is maybe not easy to set up or it's very specific and there aren't instructions on how to do that. And so as a community, especially for projects that are owned by Kubernetes SIGs, do we have a responsibility to make sure that new users can operate the tooling to build these things so that someone could do a drive-by PR that updates the dependencies or changes something like that? And this kind of goes into some other examples about like CI/CD and how do contributors understand that? And I think this is where I'd like to hand it to you to talk about like how does a new user understand prow and test infra and how all these things are knit together?
It's crazy. It takes time, unfortunately. But there is, we've had successfully onboarded people and teams into the various things that, in the end of the day, it's community built, community driven, right? So, we have the test infra repository. There is a new prow repository that hosts the code. And, once you get somebody through, like, here is the test grid, here is the aggregated results, here is the prow dashboard, and here is how you look at the logs. You thread the needle between all these things a couple of times, and they get the hang of it. But then if we go beyond that, then it's going to become harder for people. Even this is hard. And I always point them to, hey, go look at the SIG testing intro talk from the last KubeCon. Come and ask me questions, right? Like, so that was one of the tips that I end up giving to people.
And if you're a user who wants to add a new feature, right, and you want to add new tests, new end-to-end tests to support that, this can become even more complicated, right? Yeah. So, and then I think the last example, okay, check your accounts, right? Here's a great story, and I said I wouldn't name names, but since this is a Kubernetes SIGs, project, Cluster API, we, like many other projects, use Google Docs for our agendas. And a few years ago, we had a changeover where the ownership of our agenda doc got submerged or disappeared by the company that owned it because the account privileges had changed. And so we lost a few years of history, and we as a SIG, or we as a group, had to come together and figure out, okay, we need a backup plan for how we keep this agenda going, how we keep it open. And so, does your project have like a what do we call it there, like a disaster plan, basically. If there's a sudden change in leadership, how is that handled?
This actually happened last week also because we have the enhancements Google Doc under SIG architecture, and somebody changed the permissions. We haven't been able to figure out who changed the permissions. So everybody has read-only permissions and not even comment. So we made a copy, and we're gonna put it in a shared drive for sure. So the one we are talking about here is like a corporate account creating a Google Doc, and then somebody changing jobs, so they no longer have access to that account. Yeah.
Is that a case for maybe we should be running our own services for that rather than Google Docs?
You're absolutely right. So we're talking to CNCF folks. Rian and I just had that conversation yesterday about hey, you're doing this nice and fancy thing for Zoom, URLs. You'll hear about it from Rian. I'm not going to spoil the surprise. Can you do the similar thing for docs too? But yeah, so currently the the Kubernetes steering can create shared directories in our Google workspace infrastructure for different teams, and then a lot of people have migrated to it. It's just that when things are working, we don't pay attention. When things are not working, then we are like, okay, we are panicking, right? So even though people know that they can do it right now, there has to be an impetus for the change to happen, right?
And unfortunately, that impetus is usually things broke. We need all hands on deck, right?
Right. Who has a copy?
Right. Who has a copy? Right. So we kind of thought about some open questions, and this is why we're here. We want to have a discussion with all of you. How does the community add new features to projects? How do we decide who makes those decisions? How do we decide which project they should land in? Are there practices that we could be following? Are there things that we could be telling our community to do, or suggestions that we could be making that would improve the ground state for everyone, in terms of tooling and participation and those kind of things? And then, in a world where we've all decided that the CNCF owns this code, and by extension, the SIGs are the maintainers of it, what does that mean for a project that is dominated by a specific company? And how should the SIG act in a way where, we don't want to chase people away from these projects regardless of where they work. We want to collaborate successfully. And so how can we as a community kind of pay mind to the needs of our corporate sponsors while at the same time being able to take user input from all over the place? So who's got the answers to these questions? Yeah, absolutely.
Clarifying question about the... I don't understand why you can't submit a pull request to the AWS Cloud Provider repo, and that part's foggy to me.
You absolutely can.
Yes, you can. So essentially what had happened was 2 years ago, there was a decision made around, hey, we are not going to use the cloud provider AWS repository for the load balancer functions. It will maintain the same code that was there, which was extracted from KK. So whatever was in KK is in this repository. We are not going to make any more changes there, right? And then even before the extraction happened, there was another repository that was already created called AWS Load Balancer, which already had support for the older style and the newer style, right? So when people come here to this repository to make a change in the load balancer, we kind of tell them, look, this is supposed to have the same code as that was extracted. If you need any new changes, you need to go there because that is the one that is going to be supported. You can have a PR here, you can merge a PR here, but then if you come back, then you're really not going to get support from the team because the team is working on that repository already, right? So we might as well work with you on making sure that what you need is in that repository. So that was the context. Does it help?
Yeah, so this is like a two-part thing, right? Yeah. So to get really into the dirty details here, right? And AWS has multiple types of load balancers, right? There's like application load balancers, classic load balancers, network load balancers. And the reason for creating the load balancer controller at the time, right? Like the service code was in KK at that moment, right? And we had already made the decision that we were going to pull the code out of KK. And so if we're going to create new load balancer features for the new types of, at the time, I'm not even sure application load balancers had as many features as they do now. So if we're going to add features for the application load balancers, the team that's maintaining it, who happen to be AWS employees, they said, we're going to put them in the load balancer controller because we're not done with this extraction, and there might be other design decisions that are important to that, right? But now here's where the rub comes in, right? We, meaning Red Hat, I was part of a group of developers who was looking at these things, and we're saying, hey, there's this feature of load balancers that should be in the CCM as we see it, right? In the Cloud Controller Manager. And so when we proposed the PR, that's when we started to get into this discussion about, okay.
I think it was issue.
It was issue, yeah. We started with an issue, right? Yeah.
And you want to use the Cloud Controller Manager in OpenShift so that it. Okay, so you want that to be an entire solution.
This is one team doing something specific, not all of.
Okay, so maybe we separate like the technical details from the ownership issues.
There's like one very specific feature so between the Cloud Controller Manager and the Load Balancer Controller, Load Balancer Controller covers, I think, the network load balancers and application load balancers. And the Cloud Controller Manager covers classic load balancers and network load balancers. There was a feature of network load balancers, and if I say load balancers like too many more times, I think I'm going to start tripping up, so just fair warning. There's a feature in the network load balancer that we were curious. It was about security groups, right? And if you're using the load balancer controller, there's a way to exercise that feature. I think you use like an annotation on the service or something, and then you can get it to include the service group on but it doesn't work on the other one, right? So we're saying, all right, did you want to?
Exactly right. So the other twist is the AWS load balancer controller is a long existing project that's been there for 4 or 5 years, and that started before the extraction happened for cloud provider AWS. So everybody who knows anything has been using that. You take any of the providers, COPS, and any of the other distros that use AWS have been using that, successfully. And this cloud provider AWS was just extraction of the code from KK. Right, so that was the twist you're right. Right, it's a snapshot, right? And you don't use this. If you really need a load balancer, use that. And it's a well-known thing. It's just that this team in Red Hat didn't know about this. And when they came, we did not have enough information for them to self-figure out. And they were like, oh, there is this issue. Let me post on this issue. And the previous comment in the issue was 2 years old. So they didn't check the date as well, right? Otherwise, they would have realized that. I think it's a little bit of both. The owners should have clearly mentioned in the README in different places that, look, load balancer is deprecated here. It's a snapshot. Don't change it. If you need it, go to this other one, right? And then, so that is basically one of the misses here.
Yeah, and this is where we start to have this is where we start to have a conversation about it, right? Because I have a different opinion about some of these things, right? So for clarity, I'm a co-chair of SIG Cloud Provider, right? So technically, when we look at the documentation says the Cloud Controller Manager is responsible for these service things, right? So as a user, it would be natural for me to look at this and say, if I'm installing Kubernetes on AWS, I want to run the Cloud Controller for AWS, right? And if there's a feature gap in the way that it does services, then as a community member, I might propose that feature there, right?
They didn't want one more controller, to run
Right,
one more
right,
extra
right,
controller.
right.
Because this controller should have that. Why do I have to run one more controller?
Well, and
which is a natural question.
right, and there's no migration path for this feature and for the way the load balancer works for that service to go from the CCM to the elbow, the load balancer controller, there without destroying the service and recreating it and everything, right? And so
that was because the older repository already existed, so it was
right.
like everybody had already migrated except for this team that was
right.
stuck on the older CCM.
Right, and so for me, the problem then becomes is that, okay, if we're going to tell the Kubernetes community that when you're installing Kubernetes, if you want these things, you install the cloud controller, right? That's what should be doing it for you. Then is it appropriate for us to put these features back in there? And how do we do that if the team that's been doing all the maintenance on it, right, is now telling us, hey, before we even extracted this code, we had already created this other controller, and that's where we'd prefer to have things go. And so then the question is okay, well, if we would like to add this feature, would it be okay if we maintained that feature or something, right? And I think this is where the conversation needs to happen, right?
Yeah. Then the question becomes okay, if you want to put the feature here, are you going to be here to maintain it? Or you will rely back on the service team to fix the things if something breaks, right? So that is the kind of conversation that will end up taking place at that point. Yeah. And has the team come back? I don't know what happened.
We're still stuck in internal conversations about this, but predicated on the notion we were going to have this session here to help understand more, where is the community responsibility around this? And, if technically, right, according to the laws as they're written by CNCF, that repository is owned by the SIG, right, then it's okay, somehow the SIG should have some input into how this gets resolved, right? And whether that means we need more documentation so that people know, hey, if you're going to use this cloud controller, you're not going to get this functionality unless you also do this thing, right? And we make that clear to users. And then as a SIG, I don't think this is the responsibility of the maintainers. I think it's the responsibility of the SIG then to say, here's how you migrate. Here's how we are testing that migration. Here's how we're showing these things, right? And so this really predicated a lot of the conversations that we have because I'm kind of like a hopeless idealist, and I want to see a world where Red Hat says, yeah, we'll put some engineers on this. We will co-maintain this with you because that's healthy for the entire community, right? Not just having a single group of people maintaining it because all the pressure falls on them, Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. The more the merrier.
Yeah.
Yeah. We need more people engaged in these things and also documenting those things and maintaining the things. And migration definitely was something that somebody should have thought about along the way, and it was probably left out.
How could you have known it then? How could they have known before the cloud controller code was extracted from Kubernetes? How could they were already writing the load balancer controller, right? Because users wanted features, they wanted the load balancer features, so they were pushing to get that in. And
I think we've beaten this to death.
Yeah. So okay.
Go to other.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
I mean, contextual clarifying question related to this kind of situation. Full disclosure, my point of view on this is when there are bits of personal point of view, my SIG chair hat off, but my personal point of view of this is common code that is used to build the thing that is Kubernetes or whatever is a community project. Parts of code that are only useful for folks on a particular rent-seeking platform, I think the owners of that particular rent-seeking platform have a moral obligation to provide the support since that code exists primarily to drive business to their rent-seeking platform. Just my personal opinion. But with that being said, in this situation where there is a AWS repo that has new features, whatever, and there is a community repo that lacks them, and then a different corporation has a monetary interest in they're shared customers, like between Red Hat for OpenShift and AWS, that feels like that collaboration could take place regardless of whether the code lives in KK or whether the code lives in some AWS repo. Like, if it is a public repo and if it is in Red Hat's best interest to have people contribute to that code, like...
Both repos are in Kubernetes SIGs.
Well, so then, yeah, like...
Right.
Just like, does SIG networking host the load balancer controller then?
No, I don't think so. Cloud provider, yeah.
All roads lead back to SIG Cloud.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
Okay, well then, it sounds like there is no problem there, and it's just purely a question of like, do you do it here or there?
So the best solution to this is for both companies to come and work in both repositories.
Sponsor the use of staff time to maintain this code that the company has a financial
That's the best
interest
outcome.
in.
Yep, agreed.
Right.
Yeah, I mean.
And to the extent that like us getting, if Red Hat gets involved to help, say we want to put this one feature in the CCM, and then the next thing we want to do is help work on the migration from CCM to load balancer controller, right? That's a huge contribution there because like we may not be interested at the moment in putting all the features from the load balancer controller into the CCM, and it's probably better just to like solve the problem that we're trying to solve and then really get to the bigger issue, which is how do we help users make this migration to use this other controller as well?
Yeah, and I mean, is that a thing where some product manager under OpenShift in Red Hat can come to like a SIG Cloud Provider or a SIG Network meeting and say, hey, Red Hat believes we have a vested interest in helping our customers build a migration path from here to there. SIG leadership, would you like us to assign some engineers to that problem? We would like to solve it anyway. It's better to solve it in community. And then I struggle to imagine the SIG leadership saying, no, do not build that valuable thing.
Yeah, no, that would be amazing, right?
Yeah.
I think that would be ideally how it would work, right? And we want to, and I think that also makes the project healthier too, because we get into these projects where it's like we become siloed, right? And it's like we're the only people looking at this. We're the tight group that we can, merge a PR in a few days if we need to, or a few hours. And then that doesn't help build the culture of like, how do I interact with someone new who comes here? How do I give them constructive feedback without just being like, no, don't do this, don't do that, whatever, right? Like, and I think it becomes healthier then because you're like, oh yeah, remember when we worked with Red Hat to add that feature and like now they're sticking around to maintain this and maybe there's some community member who shows up and says, I want to help maintain this or even I just want to come do a rebase and get my first PR into Kubernetes or something, right? Like, how do we make this more open?
Yeah, because like if a random user to some AWS specific thing wants to contribute a fix because they find it easier to just fix it themselves than to chase it through support. Cool, good for them.
Absolutely.
But like, don't expect people to be maintaining an AWS specific thing on their weekend.
Right. So that goes back to a problem that we had a little bit earlier where some of the CI jobs that were in a Kubernetes SIGs AWS repository was using an account, AWS account, which was AWS owned, so you couldn't like peek behind the scenes to see what was happening. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I did after I joined AWS and we got the AWS credits was like, okay,
migrate that to community-controlled accounts and things.
Shut that down. Nobody knows who created it or what is running or how it was set up, and copy the stuff over to like community-owned AWS account that is under SIG K8s Infra. That's open to all the members of SIG K8s Infra, Marco and Kubernetes folks and like, Arno and everybody has access to it. So, and if there is something not working, it ran out of load balancers or ENIs or whatever, then you open an issue in K8s.io and get the community to fix it. Nobody's going to give you access to anything behind the scenes. This is the mandate I gave the service teams. Like, no, you're not getting access to fix anything. You're not going to be able to peek behind the scenes. And the only thing you have access is to the logs, which is exactly what the community has access to.
What everyone else has to.
What everyone else has to. And for everything else, you open up a issue and you go through it. So that's how we solved that problem before. So, yeah.
So, like, how do we make this better, right? How do we as maintainers and SIG chairs and everyone else in the community, how do we create this inviting space? You know, how do we do this, right? Like, what are the next steps we take to get there? And, you know, that's why exactly. That's why we want to, like, talk about this and understand, like, what do I need to do to make it better? You know, what does DIMS need to do? What do we all need to do?
Let's open it up a little bit too, right? Like, do you have distinctions in, like, hey, you're a general Kubernetes maintainer, or you're part of the service team, and, like, you know, you do different set of things, and, like, do you have that distinction in how you interact?
I mean, I would say, just to try and start that conversation and prompt other folks to answer that question, I work at Datadog. I'm happy to say that. I'm open about that. I have several Kubernetes leadership roles. Those Kubernetes leadership roles are mine personally. They are not the Datadog chair of SIG security. If I leave Datadog, I keep those community roles, and my leadership within Datadog recognizes the importance of that, recognizes the importance of my independence and, like, my moral integrity as a maintainer, and they recognize that there is value in helping the project along, you know, by giving me leave to work on upstream things during work time at times. And so, like, what are other ways that folks have that kind of relationship?
I was going to say, I try to, be aware of what hat I'm wearing. So, I mean, sometimes I am a SIG Cloud Provider TL, and when I'm being a SIG Cloud Provider TL, I try to be clear that that's the role I'm playing, and that is the point I'm representing, and it will, sorry, boss, it will occasionally be negative to the company for which I work. Other times I am there being a Google engineer, and I try to be clear that I am representing Google at this moment, and I am not acting as a SIG Cloud Provider TL. I am working as a Google engineer representing my company.
Yeah, I like that, being clear about kind of where you're coming from and where you're standing whenever you're commenting on these things.
I just wanted to mention, I've seen this happen over the last 10, 12 years. You're almost always going to be much more successful in mixing the maintainer list at the beginning of a project. Doing it after the fact, when it's already swamped by one corporation, it becomes almost untractable. Okay, to bring it together is going to require a great resource. So just do it right the first time. just saying.
I love that advice. Do it right the first time. I mean, I like that. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And, like, Dims and I were talking about this, and I think we met way back in the OpenStack days. Many of you might have also been there for the OpenStack days. And this is not a problem that is unique to Kubernetes, right? We've seen this in other large open source projects. It's just Kubernetes is now, like, the largest open source project, right? And it's generating a lot of value for people. And so there's a huge competition to do all this stuff, right? And yeah, you're right. Like, if we can have it better from the beginning, that's awesome. Now we're coming in, we have to figure out, how do we make it better now, Who else has thoughts?
Yes.
Hey folks, I've been doing open source project contribution almost since the very beginning of my career. Yes, that's been almost 13 years with IBM, some of my old colleagues work here. Right now I'm with Bloomberg, it's almost 2 years. I'll say the dream was like this. If the community interest is quite well aligned with your company interest, that's perfect. You can work for your company interest, community interest, even somewhat your personal interest at the same time. That's a perfect match. But not always working that way. We come from the OpenStack era. By the end of 2015 or early 2016, I remember, I think every people remember that kind of shift, paradigm shift, especially from almost all the company in the tech company. Either they didn't make that much money on top of almost that, or whatever reasons, they move their manpower out of that community, then some other company swarming. So for folks, they either say, I'm such a fan of this project, I'm going to continue doing with it, so I have to shift it and change my job to work for some new company so that I can continue to contribute. Same reason happened to me. I've been working with OpenStack for many years, and later serverless, and then Knative, but somehow my companies disrupt their support of Knative, so I have to move to some company that is using Knative and just still using right now. That's how make me still that kind of the lead of that operation work in Knative since almost the very beginning. That's how I can make it happen. Otherwise, I have to retreat as well. And but by the way, we believe in meritocracy for sure, and all my connections, almost all my connections are built within this nice open source project, not necessarily just my company. That's my personal experience, which is fantastic. I believe which is fantastic. But the only thing is that the dream was like, if we can align company, community, and your personal interests together, that's perfect. But otherwise, we need to find how we can deal with that.
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point, and I agree with you. If you can align all those interests, it's great. It doesn't always happen. Right. And, I love, again, I'm a hopeless optimist, right? I love the notion that many of us, or maybe most of us, or I would hope all of us are here because we believe in open source technology. We believe in that methodology for creating software, right? And now how do we lean into that more, right? How do we continue to kind of promulgate that idea, that ethos, so that the newer people coming into this, the younger generations coming into this, people maybe who are just new to open source, that they start to take in this message of you can be part of this. If you see something, you can get involved. And it's not just, is it aligned with my company's interests or whatever? Maybe if I have a personal interest in software, and this goes back to kind of, working on your weekends or whatever, right? Then that's great. And if I can bring that personal interest in alignment and figure out, how does my company get value out of this, or how do I bring those things together? That's going to create for a very healthy future for these things. But I guess that's what we're trying to figure out. How do we keep sharing this message? And telling stories like this is great. Who else has got one? Are we out of time already? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for sharing and listening. And yeah, let's just get out there and build more stuff, right?